6:17 now at KLIF. Investigators only just beginning to examine why Stephen Paddock opened fire yesterday, killing 59 people in an outdoor concert. They, of course, have scoured his home and his car and his storage facilities, and they're interviewing family members and all that kind of stuff. And they have a hard drive they've recovered from his home that they're going to try to analyze.
Anytime something of this nature happens, and of course it's never been this big, we all try to figure out why. What happens to somebody that they can do something like this? But this case is even stranger than usual. This is a 64-year-old man who had no criminal record, no history of trouble with people. He had a lot of money.
Yeah. His family says they don't understand what happened.
Family says they're just stunned by what happened. Let's talk with psychiatrist Dr. David Henderson with Four Stones Collaborative Group. Good morning, Dr. Henderson. I imagine you've been talking about this practically nonstop for the last 24 hours or so.
Well, I have, and the reality is you're exactly right. Whenever something tragic like this happens, we need to make sense of it. We want to bring answers to the table so that we can feel safer and more comfortable re-engaging the world. And it's a very stressful, very sad, overwhelming situation, and it's tragic. So we're all asking the same questions. What happened?
Does Stephen Paddock fit any type of profile that you're familiar with?
Well, there are some indicators, there are some things that are of concern, and I can speak in a general sense. Anytime someone acts in a rageful, violent, premeditated way, there are usually three components that they've been struggling with internally. The first is a sense of injustice. No one acts the way he did without having some axe to grind or sense of unfairness. The second is a feeling of meaninglessness, that life has no purpose and no value. And so I'm going to do something heinous and intentional to create that feeling of meaninglessness in others. And then the last is a need to control an otherwise helpless situation. There's an old song from the 90s that the tagline says, "Despite all my rage, I'm just still a rat in a cage." And I would imagine that anytime someone acts in a way like this, they're struggling with at least one, if not all three of those psychological struggles. And it may have been the case for him that there was something underlying all this that just came to a head.
Something you said just a moment ago, I kind of focused on it, and that is the sense of meaninglessness. This guy's 64 years old. He's got a lot of money. He doesn't seem to have any friends or family, and he's been described, as we so often hear, as a loner. He kept to himself, and he was very quiet, and nobody knew anything about him. And I wonder if some of that might have to do with simply part of the aging process in some people who have accomplished and achieved a lot, but wonder, what's next? Is there anything left for me here?
Absolutely. Certainly at the latter stages of life, individuals are asking the question, what have I done with my life up until this point? What have I, experienced that's been significant? And am I, in the last stages here, do I have anything of value to hold on to? In the case of his gambling issue, it's clear that the problem that existed there was an addiction of some sort. There was an impulsivity that he was engaging in with thousands of dollars of spending and gambling.
Yeah, that would indicate that he really craved excitement of some sort at all times.
Craved excitement, craved that stimulation, and it is a trait that we see sometimes in folks that we would describe as having antisocial personality disorder. The other issue was the isolation, the fact that no one knew his thoughts or his feelings. I think in one of the interviews, his brother said that he never talked about politics or religion. So here's a guy that stays very quiet, holds things close to the chest, and doesn't have a whole lot of significant, meaningful relationships in his life. And that's something that's essential to all of us in addressing our feelings of meaninglessness and injustice and helplessness. We need relationships with people. And the last thing I really want to address is the fact that, hey, this guy clearly had some mental issues. We know that now after the fact. And I guarantee you there are people listening to this program right now who are themselves suffering in silence. And my response, my statement to those folks are, get the help that you need. It's time to overcome the stigma associated with dealing with our mental health and to reach out and to get that help because, we all have issues. We all have struggles. And left unchecked, we have the capacity to do anything. And that's very clear based on what we've seen, in all of this.
But does a person who may be listening or who may be having anxiety necessarily know that they need the help? What can family members or friends do? What are some telltale signs that you can help somebody who may be having problems and get them the help that they need?
Well, anytime you notice a distinct personality change in the person that you love or that you care about, that they start pulling away, perhaps they start getting rid of things in their home. Maybe they're struggling with drugs or alcohol or a gambling addiction or some other behavioral issue. Ask them good questions. Learn to be someone that is curious and that asks good questions. And when you get to a point where you can do that, you're doing one of two things. You're learning about the individual themselves, but you're also challenging them to self-reflect and ask questions about their own life and experience. And in doing so, developing a self-awareness within them. And that can often be the impetus that gets someone to reach out and ask for help.
One thing we do know, though, about clinical depression and associated problems is that people who are suffering don't care about anything, including their own depression. There must be a certain degree of self-awareness that is in opposition to those problems.
Well, and again, this is moving into maybe even preventative work, and that is, we have so many people that are taking selfies on social media of their physical fitness. I've worked out at the gym, look at my muscles. If we would place the same value on our mental health as we do our physical appearance and body shape, I guarantee you things would change in terms of our environment and our society. If we would place that value early on and instill the fact that we need to be caring for our minds and our brains, and when tragic situations occur, or micro traumas, as we might call them, that it's okay to reach out and to process and to talk with someone. And that's something that we could be instilling into our kids, even at a very young age, before they get to adulthood and they feel this sense of isolation, that if I share and I talk about what I'm dealing with, the world is going to judge me. And that's a dangerous thing that we have to prevent.
If someone's listening and they do need help, is there a number they can call right now?
Absolutely. Well, there's a suicide hotline that people can call. It's very easy to get in touch with someone if you're struggling with suicidal thoughts, and there are people waiting to be able to talk with you. And it's also important, I think, you can go to my website. It's fourstonesgroup.com. I've got several resources listed for folks to reach out and contact people in Metroplex. So help is available. It's very readily accessible. It's just a matter of making the decision to overcome the shame and the stigma and reach out and ask for help.
Dr. Henderson, thank you so much. I wish we had more time. You're a fascinating guy. Very, very informative. We appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the show.
That's Dr. David Henderson, a psychiatrist with Four Stones Collaborative Group.
Also, yesterday, they released that Paddock had set up cameras inside and outside the hotel room. Outside to warn him when the SWAT team, in this case, was, zeroing in on him at Mandalay Bay. Inside, we assume, to more or less record what he was doing. Dr. David Henderson, board-certified psychiatrist and the owner and founder of Four Stones Collaborative Group in Dallas, my guest. Dr. Henderson, thanks so very much for being here. Does any of this shed light on the mindset of Stephen Paddock?
Well, I was saying this even before any of this evidence came out, that there are three main reasons why someone commits an act of violent rage: premeditated, planned out, vindictive. Anybody that's struggling with this kind of underlying seething anger that leads to something like this. One is a sense of injustice. Somewhere in his life, there was a feeling that life was unfair. People had treated him wrongly, violated him, and that he was going to return the favor. The second is the issue of meaninglessness. Anytime people feel that their life has no purpose, no value, that they can't achieve success through healthy, normal means of pursuit, a lot of times they take the other direction and they go to something completely destructive and impart that sense of meaninglessness and confusion to others. And then the last is the issue of helplessness. When someone gets frustrated or angry and they feel that they can't have the kind of control that they want, hey, they go and they destroy. It's that line from the Smashing Pumpkins song, despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in a cage. And we see people who are acting violently, displacing that anger and frustration onto others. And so there's now, with this information coming out, that's certainly bearing true that this guy was troubled. He had a very troubled past, a troubled childhood, a family history of violence and criminality, and that had to have had a profound impact on his psychology. And so to do something like this, I've said before, if you can't be the hero in your own story, sometimes to maintain the significance, you become the villain instead, and it's clear that he had a wish to do so.
Well, Dr. Henderson, this guy, Stephen Paddock, was 64 years old. If you've listened to anything his brother has said, the family, what did it say? What did he say? It's like being hit by an asteroid, as how shocked they were at this behavior, that Stephen Paddock had a lot of money. He was claiming he was a multimillionaire. He was successful. He was living the good life. You can't tell me at 64 years old there isn't somebody around this guy who said he's a wackadoodle.
Well, again, there was a recent article in the news stating that they had interviewed some neighbors and people that he had interactions with, that he was surly in his personality, gruff, isolative, kept to himself. And a lot of people are saying, well, how could this guy have done something like this? And my attitude is that this is exactly the type of profile that would do something like this, because you have an individual that is not speaking out, not talking about what he's feeling internally, emotionally, what is going through his mind, keeping those kinds of things close to the chest until it's too late. And, honestly, there are a lot of people, I'm sure, that are listening even right now who struggle with things like depression, anxiety, anger issues, that addictions, that are not reaching out and getting help, that are staying silent and quiet. And my encouragement to those folks is there is still time to be the hero in your story. You don't have to be the villain. Get the help that you need. Reach out to someone who can encourage you in a positive direction. And as a whole in society, let's start talking about mental health, and let's start working to prevent these kinds of incidences by encouraging people to reach out and not stigmatizing folks for with their internal psychology and getting the help that we need. If we as a society would stop focusing so much on personal physical fitness and how big my muscles are and how shapely my figure is, and start valuing our mental health instead, I think that's where we would see the change taking place in our society.
A couple of follow-up questions here. Dr. Henderson, who is a board-certified psychiatrist, the owner of Four Stones Collaborative Group in Dallas. Thanks for being here again. You had mentioned that some of Stephen Paddock's neighbors are now saying he became gruff, he was isolated. Let's take it to present day. You live next door to somebody who all of a sudden, would it be a neighbor or a family member that you notice? Would it be a drastic change that would alert you that something's wrong, or is it a change that takes place over, a couple of months, a year, so you really wouldn't notice the change? You see what I'm getting at?
Yes, I think it's possible, to notice change. But here's the thing: the only way you're going to notice change in people is if you become a people person. And this is an epidemic that is so great in our society. We have become isolative as a whole. We can't go out into public and into society and look anyone anymore and carry on conversations. We hardly know our neighbors because we have our faces stuck in our phones and our computers.
I have a question for you, Doctor. This is Karen Curtis. This man had no social media footprint at all, zero. What does that tell you that he's not on Facebook? He's not, he's totally isolated.
Well, it tells me that he is completely isolated. No social engagement. And you're looking at personality profile that can do like this, they're not engaging for people. They are not relational. There's a lack of empathy. There's a lack of ability to connect with others. And if you look at the DSM-5 and the diagnostic criteria for what we call antisocial personality disorder, you will see all of those kinds of traits laid out. And so, I don't know this guy personally, but in general, the types of people that can carry out these acts have very specific personality styles and very specific characteristic traits.
And Dr. David Henderson, our psychiatrist and the owner of Four Stones Collaborative Group in Dallas, how can people get in touch with you?
Folks can go to our website. It's fourstonesgroup.com, or my personal website, drdavidhenderson.com. That's drdavidhenderson.com.
Great. Thank you so very much for shedding some light and some profound enlightenment there for all of us, I think.
I understand the camera is outside, but why the camera is inside? That's my one of the questions. A question a lot of people have. Joining me now, Dr. David Henderson, board-certified psychiatrist. Doctor, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks for having me on the show.
All right, first of all, let's start with what kind of a darkness has to lurk in a man's soul to fire aimlessly at 22,000 people he doesn't know with fully automatic weapons? What kind of darkness lurks in that man's heart?
Well, I don't know. The phrase "darkness lurking in his heart," I'm not sure exactly how to define that, but I will say there are three main factors that we usually see in folks who have rage, anger, this sort of premeditated vindictiveness against society. The first is a sense of injustice. Clearly, this guy somewhere in his life had felt that he was treated unfairly, that life was unfair, people were unfair, and that by engaging in this act, he was somehow bringing a sense of rightness back to his reality. The second is an issue of meaninglessness. Anytime someone feels that life has no purpose, has no value, oftentimes they take that anger and frustration out and do something extremely meaningless to others, imposing that sort of fear and confusion into their life. And then the final element that most people in these sort of situations experience is a sense of helplessness. And, there's an old song by the Smashing Pumpkins, and the tagline is, "Despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in a cage." And sometimes when someone feels extremely helpless to deal with the pain that they're suffering from in their own life, they react in very irrational, destructive ways in order to continue to maintain a sense of control, even if it's a morbid sense of control. Hey, if I can't be the hero in my own story, but I want to be significant, maybe I decide to be the villain instead.
Here's a man who is a multimillionaire, a developer, a high-stakes gambler who would have a habit of as much as $30,000 a day on some days. He was not hurting for money. He had a tremendous amount of success. He had what would appear to be a comfortable home and a comfortable life. Had a girlfriend, although he apparently had some public feuds with her and some spats of some sort. But this is not the kind of guy we don't see the kind of, problems you would sometimes associate with somebody who would be a shooter like this.
Actually, no, I would disagree. I would say he is exactly the type of person that would do something like this. And here's why. The more that we discover about this guy, and I was saying this even before this information came out, but the more we discover about some of the psychological struggles that he had, even as a child. His father was taken away from the family when he was a kid. The father was a criminal himself, and multiple things about his personality that would suggest that he was suffering deeply psychologically. The problem was that he kept silent about it. And, my issue today is that we can make this a political issue or we can make it a mental health issue. And I would say that we spend too much time focusing on superficial things and we don't focus enough on the stigma that exists in people talking about their emotions, what they're feeling, what they're dealing with, what they're struggling with internally. And because of this, we experience these explosive rage incidences because people are not reaching out and getting the help that they need because they're afraid to talk about it. And I guarantee you there are people listening to this show right now that are struggling with things like depression, anxiety, anger, resentment, and they are afraid to reach out. And my encouragement is there is still time for you to be the hero in your life story. Don't be the villain. Don't keep quiet. Reach out, get the help that you need, and change the trajectory of your life. It is possible to do because I've seen it in my own life, and I've seen it in the lives of the clients that I work with every single day.
Now, I've seen different people, as you can imagine, on social media. Of course, from the left, they point at the right and say, you didn't fund these projects for mental health. From the right, they point to the left and they say, well, you guys closed down many of the mental health facilities beginning in the 1950s. A lot of finger pointing, a lot of blaming going on, but that doesn't seem to solve many problems overall.
It doesn't solve the problem, and honestly, it does start at an individual level. The question is, do individuals value their mental health? Listen, if we would stop taking selfies of ourselves, working out at the gym and demonstrating how we're changing our physical body or what outfit we're wearing or what meal we just had, and maybe we started to value as much the unseen things about our personality and about the emotions that we feel and start focusing on those elements, maybe that's where we would actually see change taking place. And if we could start talking in an open forum and engaging in these kinds of discussions and stop having people ostracized who are open about their struggles, whatever they may be, that's, I think, where the change occurs. And that can start in our homes. It can start with ourselves personally, making that difficult step to reach out and talk to someone about what you're dealing with mentally or emotionally in your life. There is no shame in getting help.
Is there pure evil? You say that you don't understand darkness in somebody's heart. Do you believe in evil people that just have evil intent?
I believe that we are all influenced by evil, and we are all susceptible to it. And anybody who is listening right now and thinks, oh, well, I could never do something like what that man did, you are at probably a greater risk of being susceptible to something because you are not aware of your susceptibility to any kind of pain or suffering or psychological trauma. The reality is we are all susceptible, and that susceptibility comes from, one, a lack of self-awareness of what we are capable of if we don't get help, and number two, an unwillingness to reach out and get help.
Dr. David Henderson, board-certified psychiatrist. Good enlightenment, good conversation, and good points. Thank you, sir.
Las Vegas gunman Steve Paddock killed nearly 60 people now, more than 500 injuries, as we know, Sunday night. And now news coming out, he recorded his attack with a camera that he mounted in his room. He had other surveillance in the hallway to alert him as police closed in. And so he had at least one recording of himself as he fired for approximately 72 minutes, but he also put those cameras in the hallway outside so he could see police when they were closing in, presumably so he could fire as many rounds as possible, maybe get in a better position to kill more before he ultimately took his own life. Dr. David Henderson is a board-certified psychiatrist with Four Stones Collaborative Group in Dallas. He also is an expert witness criminal cases like this. And Dr. Henderson, 23 guns. He's got ammo. He's got 10 suitcases. He's got a perch in the room chosen because of and he chose the room, by the way, because of the angle of the windows that allowed maximum sight lines into the venue below. But we've learned he's a retired accountant. He has no criminal record. He had a lot of money, maybe a gambling problem. He owned a plane. He owned 4 homes. He had a girlfriend, liked to travel, liked to cruise, loved by family and associates. The scariest thing about his background is he loved burritos at Taco Bell. That's about the most disturbing because, you know, there's Chipotle and everything else out there. Honestly, I mean, what an enigma this guy is. This is particularly a perplexing case.
He was a disturbed individual prior to all of this going down. There's some reports coming out that neighbors and people that had some interactions with him recognized that he was a surly individual, isolative, kept to himself. His brother mentioned in a news interview that he never talked about religion and politics. So this guy was a guy that held things close to the chest, and not many people knew what was going on in his mind. So that is we think, oh, well, how could this guy have done something like this? This is very typical of the profile of someone who could do something like this, someone who is not communicative, not engaging others, possibly, having a lack of empathy in relationships. And there are some factors there that point to this guy being troubled. He had a family history of violence and criminality, and I know that as a psychiatrist and folks in the mental health profession studying the brain, there is a genetic component to, psychopathy. So, there are definitely some indicators, but no one could ever have predicted that someone like this would go and do such a heinous act.
So are you saying, like, for example, I think what you're alluding to, Doc, is that his father was on the FBI most wanted list in the 70s. So are odds higher that someone is a sociopath whose close relative, or in this case his father, is also a sociopath? Is the pattern repeat?
The correlation is there, and there's a number of possible explanations for that, why that is. One is a genetic component. We know that, executive decision-making is housed in the frontal lobes of the brain, and when we study scans of criminals, we know that their frontal lobes are not the same as those who are normal counterparts. So there may be a genetic component, but it may also be just the dynamics of growing up in a family that was troubled. We know that when he was a young kid, his father was removed from the home, and that changed the trajectory of the entire family. And so who knows what kind of psychological impact that can have on someone at such a very early age. But I think it's important to note.
Yeah. Dr. David Henderson this morning is a board-certified psychologist trying to figure out what made this guy tick, Stephen Paddock, who opened fire on Sunday morning in Las Vegas. And in that regard, though, too, often when we see these cases, almost seemingly now these days, within hours, if not a day, we start to learn about affiliations with radical groups or someone who's radicalized in any way, shape, or form. Doesn't necessarily mean, ISIS. It could mean some sort of domestic terrorist group or someone whose rantings and ravings are online and you could see was a ticking time bomb. In this case, we don't have any of that, though. To me, that's the stark contrast here. And generally, you don't see a lot of 64-year-old guys out there on shooting rampages. What does that tell you?
Well, whenever someone gets to the latter stages of their life, and I'm not knocking anybody in their 60s right now, but anybody gets towards the latter stages of their life, they start looking back and asking, how am I significant? What impact have I had on the world? And quite frankly, when you create a perfect storm of psychological factors and then you have someone at that age making a decision like that to commit such an act of violence and crime, you have to wonder whether or not he was asking himself that same question. What has made me significant? And hey, when you believe that you can't be the hero in your own life story, if significance is important enough to you, sometimes you choose to be the villain. And that very well may have been the case in this guy's situation.
Well, the opposite of that, I guess, would be to take one's life, right? To end it because you see no point. You see that your time on here Earth is meaningless. And if you start to get in that downward spiral, don't many more people lash out at themselves versus strangers?
Certainly. And this was clearly not just a homicidal act, but it was a suicidal mission as well. This guy, but he turned his rage outward. And when we see individuals doing that, there are three main factors that contribute. And I can say this, for all forms of rage. One is a sense of injustice, that life is somehow unfair, or that people have treated me wrongly, and I'm going to get back at others for that. The second is an issue of meaninglessness, that my life has no value and purpose or significance. And in that state of anger and frustration, I'm going to create confusion in the lives of others. And then the last is an issue of helplessness that leads to sort of irrational decisions to maintain control. And those three common factors are where we see people most often falling when they commit these kinds of heinous acts.
I guess, too, I mean, it's relative what you described also, because people will listen to this, as I have, and go, well, wait a minute now, this guy's got a lot of money, he's retired, no criminal record, he's surrounded by friends and family who love him, he has the means to be able to afford things, it's not like he's for want, and yet somehow he feels aggrieved that there's some great injustice, there's some kind of humiliation in her life. I think most people go first world problems when they hear that.
Well, that is the ultimate existential challenge to life, and that is that, hey, money and possessions don't satisfy. And honestly, there may be people listening today that are struggling with something emotionally. Now is the time to reach out and get help and talk to someone. Don't be the villain in your life story. Make the decision to get the help that you need, face the stigma, overcome the fear, and reach out. And one thing we do know about this guy is he was silent about what was going on internally for him. And don't make that same mistake. We need to stop stigmatizing mental health and start getting people the help that we need so we do the preventative work of reducing this kind of violence and explosive rage.
You know, Dr. David Henderson, one of the things you hear about, and you said that too, is this guy tends to be a loner, and that's typical in a lot of mass serial killers and like. But, you know, how do you determine that? Because everyone's wife tells them you need to speak more. Like my wife, why don't you talk? You need to tell me what's going on. What's going on? And women are good at doing that. Guys generally bad at it, some much worse than others, obviously. But anyone listening to this who's a guy is going, well, that's my wife says it about me all the time, that you know, I kind of like to do my own thing. And, you know, I'm kind of quiet a lot of times and kind of in my own thoughts. Is there something inherently wrong about that?
There's not anything wrong about it. I think the key is an issue of self-awareness. Are we self-aware enough to know when there's a problem and when we need to process it? And what is our level of pride? You know, I think, you know, people that struggle with opening up about issues that they're battling and facing, in some cases, it is an issue of pride. I don't want to be exposed. I don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want to be put in a position where someone else might have control over me. And so I refuse to speak up. And I see that so often, but the rewards of doing so are so great. And, you know, I myself as a guy, I can relate to that. I can empathize with that fear. But, man, it's just such a powerful experience when you get help, process your emotions, and increase your self-awareness, and you improve your control in life, your power in life, and your ability to create positive change. And that's why I do what I do, because I see the results day in and day out.
So how do you do a self-analysis to know that you need help? I mean, if we go in the Wayback Machine, and Stephen Paddock heard this before he went and murdered a whole bunch of innocent people in motives that only he knows at this point, what would be triggers for him to go, hey, I need to go talk to somebody?
Well, really early on, it's sometimes listening to the advice and to the statements of people around you. Hey, you seem irritable, you seem frustrated, it seems like your personality has changed. You know, sometimes people are struggling with drugs and alcohol, and that impetus to change and make a decision is hard. But recognizing the signs, if you're starting to pull away from people, if you're starting to isolate, if you feel that you can't accomplish the day-to-day tasks in your life, like going to work or showering even, or taking care of your physical self, these are the kinds of warning signs that you may be struggling with depression or anxiety or, you know, in certain cases, you know, anger issues.
And that's interesting because, you know, you kind of withdraw a lot and people say, man, you're different, you changed. And trying to get someone who clearly needs some help to kind of force them, it's difficult, if not impossible, to do.
Well, and that's when I talk to families. I do a lot of work with families in my practice, and sometimes if the individual themselves is unwilling to change, the people around them have to make a decision to do the right thing and change themselves. And in any relationship, if one person chooses to change, others have to change alongside them or the relationship falls apart. And that's the scariest thing for family members, is that I love this person so much, I care about them, I don't want to lose them, but I do need to make that change, and I do need to set those boundaries and require things from that person. And sometimes it's a matter of requiring the person to get help if you want to continue to engage with me in this relationship, because I value the health of our relationship more than just staying together.
So do you think that the critical element in this whole thing is the girlfriend who he sent away to the Philippines, and presumably to do so she couldn't stop him from executing all of those people? and how much of this, to some degree, is on her. And I don't mean to call her as, she could have stopped this, but as she was sent away. But there's a connection there, you're saying, between her and the shooter, Stephen Paddock.
Well, the facts remain to be seen of what she knows and what she was privy to in terms of the events leading up to this. And I can't put blame on any particular individual. And our decision to put blame is often so that we can make sense of it. I remember what Amanda Knox once said. She said, we all know that there are monsters in the world, and we want to be able to identify them and know that we are not them. And sometimes we make these black and white issues, in order to feel safe. The truth of the matter is there's all sorts of factors involved in this. In the end, this guy made a decision. He is responsible for the decision. He is no longer with us. Now it's time for us to reflect on our own lives and how we can potentially take this situation and transform it from tragedy into triumph.
Dr. David Henderson is a board-certified psychologist with Four Stones Collaborative Group in Dallas, and he does a lot of criminal case expert witness work in criminal cases and the like, and offered a profile here, at least in some background. So if that's someone in your life, there may be an opportunity to get them some help, because God knows it turns out something like this. Dr. Henderson, thanks for the time. Appreciate it.